Well, hello everyone. We're going to do a different lecture for me. I usually did the 50s and the 60s as separate, but I've kind of compiled them together into what I would call the society and economy of the Cold War, which is the 50s and the 60s. Now, obviously, it's not going to cover the 70s and the 80s, which the Cold War was also then, but we're not going to have time to do all that. So I did want you to get some about the 50s and the 60s. Second thing, I want to apologize because YouTube has a lot of copyright checks. I can't play all the music, which I would love to do and normally would do if we were in the classroom, but sorry about that. So we're going to move along pretty quick here. Remember, if you get stuck or you need more information, you can always pause the lecture and back it up and that kind of stuff, which we can't do in class. So anyway, the 1950s, we come out of World War II, and the economy is a big question. Remember, we were in a depression before the war, and we went into the war, and that sort of ended the depression because everybody was expected to work. And so consequently, Truman, who was the president, had to think about, so how am I going to go from a wartime economy to a peacetime economy? And that was the biggest thing that he was worried about at that time. So what he did was he created several things here you can see. There was a general agreement on trade and tariffs and trade. And so remember, tariffs are taxes on imports. And so what he did was he made agreements with other nations that he would lower tariffs and trade restrictions. He wanted more trade to be happening. And so by lowering those taxes, that made it easier for other countries to trade with us, cost less money. He also came up with a program called the Fair Deal. If you remember the New Deal, which FDR did before, during the Depression, those were a bunch of government programs to provide help for farmers and help for business people and things like that. It didn't really go very far because Congress they said, hey, we're doing fine. We don't need those. During the Depression, we needed them, but right now we don't. And we don't want a bigger federal government. Another thing, which hasn't anything to do with the economy, was Truman ended segregation in the military. So if you went into the military, World War I, World War II, you would be put in a segregated unit. Blacks would be put in one unit, whites would be put in another unit. And I know our school is a lot of Hispanics, and the question always comes up in class, well, where did the Hispanics fit? Well, at this time, Hispanics were considered white. So when they were asked what their race was, it was white. And so, but the blacks were still segregated in World War II. And Truman said, hey, you know, because of the people like the Tuskegee Airmen, they've earned this spot. They're equals. In fact, they were better than a lot of the other pilots. So anyways, Truman thought it was about time to end segregation in the military. This is also going to be, if we had time to do the civil rights unit, this would be the time where the civil rights people started talking about, hey, we should bring equality into all of society, and that grows and grows until the 60s, late 60s, early 70s, when is the height of the civil rights movement. Martin Luther King Jr., all of that happened in the 60s, but it starts here after the war. Anyways, so the economy was booming. People were spending lots of money. Remember, they had been at war. Everybody was working, and nobody felt like it was time to go out and spend money during the war. But after the war was over, hey, why not? The government was doing things as well. All of those soldiers that went into the military were coming back. And remember, these were young men mostly. and they had left high school and gone into the military, or they had left college, or they had left their jobs and went into the military, and there were millions of them. And so the government thought this would be a good thing to do, and it would help the economy. And that is, we created a thing called the GI Bill. The official title was the Servicemen's Readjustment Act. And so this did two things. One, it educated those soldiers coming back so that they could go to college. And two, they didn't need to go find a job right away. And so they could go to school and prepare for better jobs, and they weren't asking for a job. They weren't unemployed. They were busy going to school. And so that kind of helped the economy in a couple different ways. So if you were in the military, you could go to school if you wanted to. And so when the government creates a program like this, like there's money, then what happens is people go, oh, well, if there's money, why don't we create something to take that money? And so colleges grew at a fantastic rate, and we invented a thing called a vocational school. And this was kind of like a college to learn how to be a plumber or an electrician or something you normally didn't go to college for, maybe an auto mechanic. Usually you just learned on the job as an apprentice. But they decided that, you know, if the government's going to pay, hey, why not train these guys? We'll create a school to do that. And so they created vocational schools. The other thing the GI Bill did was also helped anybody who was in the military, any veteran, they could buy their first home. And normally when you buy a home, you have to put a down payment. The bank wants to see that, you know, you've got some skin in the game, that you care. Otherwise, you know, if you don't want to make your payments, who ends up taking, you know, they get the house back, but they're going to lose money on that. And so they want a down payment. So what the government did was pretty ingenious. They just said they don't need a down payment. If they default on their loan, a default means that they don't make their payments and you have to kick them out of the house. If you have to repossess their house, we will make sure that you get your money. And so if GI didn't pay his bills and he got kicked out of the house, the government would step in and protect the bank. And so the banks are going, this is awesome. We can loan money, which is how banks make money, and we don't have to take a risk. The government's going to cover that. And so they were happy to loan money, and GIs didn't have to save up money. Generally, a down payment for a house is 20%. So on a house today, 20% is like $100,000. So you have to save up that kind of money to get the 20% down. And so a lot of these people wouldn't be able to buy houses. Well, now they could, because they could buy a house without a down payment. And so that made them happy. It made the banks happy, and also created a construction boom. There were tax cuts. You know, the Congress decided, hey, we're going to cut taxes, and this will allow people to have more money. You know, during this COVID virus thing, the government gave money to people. And I know people that got that money used it to pay rent and buy groceries and that kind of stuff, so it was good for them. But guess who it was also good for? It was good for the businesses that they were spending the money at. So this cutting taxes and giving people more money to spend actually was really good for the economy. All right. There was also this plan. General George Marshall, whoa, look at all those pictures going. Let's see here. Oh, I got a problem with this slide. Sorry. So let's go back. General George Marshall created a thing called the Marshall Plan. And what the Marshall Plan did was it gave millions and millions of dollars to European countries that were hurt after the war. And then that was to help them rebuild their economy. Remember, we talked about that to keep them from going communist. If they were not poor, if their businesses were working, then they could, they wouldn't be tempted to become communist. And so we wanted that, and it made good trading partners. And so when we traded with those European countries, we actually got our businesses made money by being able to trade with those European countries. So it helped our businesses and it helped Europe. And like it says right there, after the war, it was just been a long time, and people were tired of being thrifty and not going out and having fun and not buying stuff because there was a war going on. And so it just felt good to be able to go out and spend some of the money that they hadn't been able to spend. All right, technology and industry. So during the 50s, there was a lot of development of technology and industry, and we made some remarkable advancements. There was a thing called a franchise, and as you can see, there was a McDonald's. And a franchise is an idea like so if you go around all over, wherever there's a McDonald's, those McDonald's are independently owned. They're not owned by the McDonald's company. McDonald's just makes the food. You have to buy a franchise, and that gives you the right to put their name on the front of your restaurant, and you have to do what they tell you to do. It has to look like it looks like a McDonald's. It's got golden arches, and you're not allowed to sell whatever you want. You have to sell McDonald's food. So this is the way franchises became very popular, and I've never seen a McDonald's that went out of business. So if you could afford to buy a franchise, you could pretty much guarantee that you were going to be successful, and that's still true, like with McDonald's. And they'll tell you where you can build it. You can't build a McDonald's next door to another McDonald's. They go, oh, no, no, no. You have to move it out somewhere else, and they will even help you find a place that will do it. But that's the way franchises work. They were invented in the 1950s and very popular, not just McDonald's. We also invented a thing called a transistor. And this is kind of hard to explain, so I'm just going to let it go. But this was the first, well, no, it wasn't the first. It was the second step to inventing computers. So we had tubes before transistors, but tubes were like light bulbs. They were big, and they burned a lot of energy, and they were slow, and they could only do a little bit. Transistors were much smaller. They were about the size of a pea, and they did the same thing that the tubes did. Nowadays, we have other things. We have microchips, and there are millions and millions of these little switches inside of one microchip. Back and then, you can see the picture here. This was a computer. The whole room was a computer. So you can imagine, you look at the iPhones or the computers we have today, even any kind of phone, is probably 10 times, 100 times more powerful than the computer you see in that room. And that was because we could make the switches smaller. And that was what the transistor did. So that was a huge invention for technology. In medicine, Dr. Jonas Salk invented a vaccine for polio. Right now, our doctors and scientists are looking for a vaccine for the coronavirus. And they say that there's probably 40 different laboratories that are working on that right now. Well, back then, polio was the dreaded disease, and took a lot of lives and crippled a lot of people. And so we made a huge advancement in medicine, and polio today is almost unknown in the United States. There are some places in the world where it still pops up, but they're able to squash it down because there is a vaccine. All right, so that was pretty important in the 1950s. Another switch in American business and society was that we switched jobs. Now, if you remember back in the 20s, we switched from rural to urban living. More people lived in cities than lived in the country, and farming became less populated. In other words, there were fewer farmers. We had more machines. We could grow more food with less people, and people could move to the city and get better jobs and do okay. So in the 1920s, we moved from a rural society to an urban society. In the 1950s, we moved from blue-collar jobs to what they call white-collar jobs. Now, blue-collar jobs are ones where you kind of get dirty. They wore blue shirts because they didn't show the dirt. If you wear a white shirt, all it takes is a little bit of dirt and it shows up. So working in factories, making things, the trades like plumbing and carpentry and those are all considered blue-collar jobs. But after 1956, more Americans had white-collar jobs than blue-collar jobs. And those kind of jobs were working behind a counter, selling something, giving information, service jobs. Right? And so it was a different kind of labor. You didn't have to have muscles and dexterity and all that kind of stuff. So that was a big switch in American society, going from blue collar, or what we would call working man jobs, to jobs that you could do sitting behind a desk or behind a counter or something like that. Probably we're going to make the same sort of a jump here. We're going to be doing tech jobs here in a while. And that's going to be more important than any kind of service job, because the computers will be doing the service for us. So society moves along with technology. We'd had this thing called the baby boom from 1946 to 1964. So this is where all of these young men come back from war, and a lot of them got married before they left, but many of them waited until they came back to be married. And so when they came back, and the economy was doing good, and the depression was gone. So we had for like 20 years felt like, you know, it was dangerous. It costs a lot of money to have a family, and you have to be optimistic about the future to get married and have children and all that kind of stuff. If you're not optimistic, then people hold off on that. So there was nothing to hold them back. And so after all of this mess, the war and the depression, people thought, hey, times are good, let's have a family. And so there was a massive amount of children that were born, and we called it the baby boom. I'm one of those. I was born in 1954, right smack dab in the middle of the baby boom. Let's see. Some pictures. So, not only did families develop and all of those things, everything that goes along with having children, baby clothing and food and diaper service, all of these things were contributing to the growth of the economy. We were building houses because of the GI Bill. Guess what? That helps construction companies. All of these factories and companies that make stuff for babies, that helped them. So you see, one thing fed the next, and that fed the next, and it was just like a huge expansion in our economy. So we were doing really well. We also were able, because of, we'll talk about cars in a little bit, we were able to move away. It was hard. There weren't enough houses. And so that's why I said this actually helped the construction industry, because they were going, great, we need to hire more people so we can build more houses, because people want to buy houses and there aren't enough to buy. And so they started building a lot of houses, and what they did was they came up with a system for building houses that was faster than ever before. Before this, people pretty much did houses one at a time. You built a house. You wanted a house, you bought a piece of property, you hired a contractor, you drew up some plans, and you built your house. Well, contractors understood that we could do it faster if you could build the houses the same. Kind of like Henry Ford in the Model T was able to make cars because every Model T was the same. If you make houses and they're all the same, then you can make houses faster. And so that's kind of what they came up with. They were inexpensive homes. They all had a similar floor plan. Usually what they do is they take one house and they would build it, and then the house next door, they would turn the house 90 degrees. So it was the same house, it just looked different from the street. Or they would paint it a different color, or they would do something just a little bit different, but pretty much it was the same house. Or maybe they had 2 or 3 different houses, and they would build one house, and then the next house, and then house A, house B, and then house C, and then they'd build house A again and turn it. So it looked like there was maybe 6 different houses, but there was only 3. And even if you went inside those houses, they looked a lot alike. We call these tract homes. And tract homes were invented by a company in New York. It was called Levittown. And they could build houses, and they looked very similar, and they were nice little houses and very inexpensive. You can see $11,000 to buy a house. And the price was $67, your payment on that was $67 a month. So that was amazing. Almost anybody could afford a house. And so there was a huge housing boom, and people were actually buying houses as fast as they could build them. And so that, in Southern California, that was huge, and almost, you look around and almost all the houses that are built today are tract houses, even the bigger ones. Well, cars, the 50s are famous for cars, and the cars changed. Because we were living in suburbia, we had to move in, we had to go into town, we had to make room for the family. Station wagons became pretty normal. Women were starting to drive more, and we wanted it to be nice and easy. We invented a thing called automatic transmission, and that enabled more people to drive and easier to get out of the city. Let's see, I'm hoping, yes. Two-car families, because the dad would go to work and the mom was expected, we'll talk about women later on, but mom was expected to stay home and take care of the kids and cook and clean and do all those things. And of course, we wanted her to be able to get around to the stores and all that kind of stuff. So two cars became the norm. When we built houses in the 40s and the 30s, there was a one-car garage. The houses that are built in the 50s and the 60s, they have two-car garages because that became the norm. Also, the cars were huge. We sold 8 million of them in 1955. This is a 54 Oldsmobile, or 53. But they were big and they were luxurious. A lot of people call them land yachts because they were so, they had so many nice things like automatic transmissions and automatic dimming headlights and radios, and I mean that was unheard of before the 50s. Cars didn't have radios. Anyways, the cars in the 50s were a huge industry change. Now think about that. All the things that come along with a car. We invented drive-in restaurants. McDonald's became drive-through restaurants. Gas stations. Mechanics, dealerships, all of those things exploded with the explosion of the selling of all those automobiles. So again, more jobs, higher wages, and the economy is doing great. Like I told you, one-car garages became two-car garages. The car became part of who you were. So, like you probably, if you think about it, you go, this would be my ideal car. Why? Well, that car says something about you. When somebody sees you in that car, you think this is what they're going to see. And so it's kind of like the kind of clothes you wear. It changes, what you put on is what you want people to see and what you want people to think of you. Well, cars became that same thing, and they still are. People buy cars and they're very picky about what they want it to look like. All right, I said we were going to talk a little bit about women. Women, remember, had gone to work during World War II, a lot of them, and many of them returned home. They got married, they had children, and they were sort of returning to the traditional role that women had had in America for a long time. Many of them didn't go back. But the expectation in the 50s was that they would. So they were there to take care of children. Now, there's lots of nice things that, they tried to create modern conveniences, toasters, vacuum cleaners. They were invented in the 1920s, but they got better in the 50s. Things like automatic transmissions in the cars, that kind of stuff. So there was a lot of advertising aimed at women, and so we're going to talk about television and the movies, and that shows, you know, what women are supposed to do. If you pay attention, our media, so what you watch on Netflix and what you watch on YouTube and what you watch on television and what you see and hear kind of tells you how you're supposed to act as a woman or a man or a child or a whatever it is you are. You get those roles from the cues that your society provides to you. And so these are advertisements. Look at the appliances, but look at the tasks. Look at where they are. They're both in kitchens. It's that kind of stuff. And it teaches children, little girls and little boys, this is what women are to be or supposed to be. So they encourage this to bring women back into the home and to do their traditional roles that had been there for the last couple hundred years, and that was to have children and take care and manage the home. All right, you know, because of the society and culture, barbecues, bowling, all these family centered activities, Boy Scouts, Little League, all of this stuff, going to church was expected. Even if you weren't particularly religious, because it was a social thing. You would see your boss there, or you might see your coworkers there. People would have people over from work, and it was expected that you would entertain, and this is where you made your connections. It's called networking nowadays. But that was pretty typical in the suburbs. It's kind of like, if you look at it, it's like in 1950, we had 750 million pounds of hot dogs. By 1960, we had over 1 billion pounds of hot dogs. Potato chips, all of that kind of stuff. Things like bowling was the rage. There are still a few bowling alleys around, but not as many as there was. For camping, outboard motors, so if you went out fishing, that kind of stuff. Everything just boomed in the 50s. And let's see what else we got here. All right. I told you Boy Scouts, Girl Scouts, all of that kind of stuff. You know, most people were there. And of course, school. All right. Now, it all sounds like things were pretty good, but there were some people going, really? Is this all there is to life? A barbecue, going bowling on a Saturday night, and Boy Scouts and Little League? Is that life? Is that really what makes life good and valuable? And what had happened is during the 50s, materialism, that's the term, materialism had taken hold, and it was the stuff that was going to make you happy. If you go back to the 1920s that we studied, there was also a similar sort of view, and there was a group of people in the 20s that thought, wait a minute, something isn't right here. This isn't getting it. And they were called the lost generation. They were the ones who said, wait a minute, this doesn't make sense. Well, there was a group of people in the 50s that also looked at, you know, everybody having the same house and everybody looking the same and everybody doing the same things. It's like, no, this is not the way we were supposed to be. This is not the way life. So there were a lot of people that hated the conformity of the suburban lifestyle. And conformity is a word where everybody kind of follows the same sets of rules. So if you think about it, there is a human built-in thing. You want to conform to a certain amount. Nobody likes to be excluded from society. But you also want to be an individual. And that is, you notice that I'm different from everybody else. So we want both things. We want to be an individual, and we also want to belong. And so you can watch society go back and forth like this, where everybody conforms, and then somebody decides this is no good and we need to break out of it. And then people break out of it and they go, wait a minute, I want to be accepted. So the society goes through these cycles, and this is a cycle where conformity was huge. Everybody seemed to be doing and going after the same things, but there was a group of people that thought, "Nah, I don't think so. This isn't the way we were. You know, I can't stand out. I can't be an individual." Look at that picture. It's pretty amazing how many people there are that are the same. Everybody had a little different, but not much. All right, a couple cartoons. So this is an interesting picture. It was actually of a housing tract that opened up on move-in day. These people had bought their house while it was being built. And then they got done with all the houses, and then they would open the gate and people could move into their house. So this was moving day, move-in day at this particular housing tract. But look at the houses. They all look just about the same. So that caused people to go, wait a minute, something isn't right there. There was a new group of people. They were called the Beat generation. I left out a slide, sorry. So these were called the Beats, B-E-A-T. Beats was, and it became what we call beatniks. Beatniks were like the first hippies. The hippies were in the 60s, the beatniks were in the 50s. And they wanted spontaneity. That means don't make any plans, just do what you feel like. Don't worry about the physical things, worry about the spiritual things. It seemed like everybody was apathetic. Apathetic is a big word. It means you don't really care. So if you're apathetic about something, it means you don't care about it. You have no emotion. So they wanted emotion, and they wanted spirituality, not physical things, and they wanted stuff to be spontaneous, not planned out, and they didn't want to be conformed. They wanted to be different. And so their music and everything about them they could do was different. They didn't play the normal music that people had played. They played bongos, and they smoked pipes rather than cigarettes, and they wore berets, and a lot of them were barefoot, and they wore beards too. That was another thing, is beards were out of vogue in the 50s. Well, they brought it back, and so facial hair was part of the beatnik generation in the 50s. They had their own language. They created their own slang. Bread was a term that was used for money. You can see some of them here. Some of them are around still, and I think probably the most common one is cool. Cool used to be cold temperature. The beatniks were the ones who first started using it to go, wow, that's really good. That's cool, right? And so that one stuck, and we still use it today. But a lot of them have moved on, and just like the slang that your parents uses is not the slang you use. When you grow up, your kids will look at you like, what are you talking about? And the slang you use because of your generation will not be your children's generation. And so they had their own slang that was put together, and I thought it was pretty cool. I grew up in the late 50s, early 60s, and so some of this was mine. Just like the lost generation of the 1920s kind of expressed the angst, there were writers and artists that expressed the same thing about the 50s, these people of the Beat generation. Jack Kerouac wrote a book called On the Road in 1957. And what you'll see in these, the art and in the, like this is literature, is this it's an experience. What they want is they want you to feel something. It doesn't have to make sense. Okay, so it's pretty hard to read if you're used to stories that go along. But if you're into poetry and you want to feel the Beats did some pretty amazing writing. So Jack Kerouac wrote On the Road in 1957. He wrote this: "The only people for me are the mad ones. The ones who are mad to live, mad to talk, and mad to be saved. The ones who never yawn or say a commonplace thing, but burn, burn, burn like fabulous yellow Roman candles, exploding like spiders across the stars." Okay, I get it. He's expressing his opinion. He likes expressive people, but the way he writes it is really emotive, and he wanted people to do this. So Allen Ginsberg is the second one. He wrote a book called Howl in 1956. He later went on to become a pretty famous reporter in the news media. Anyways, Howl, a little bit like this. He said, "I saw the best minds of my generation destroyed by madness." That's an okay statement. "Starving, hysterical, naked, dragging themselves through the Negro streets at dawn looking for an angry fix. Angle-headed hipsters burning for the ancient heavenly connection to the starry dynamo and the machinery of night, who poverty and tatters and hollow-eyed and high sat up smoking in the supernatural darkness of cold water flats floating across the tops of cities, contemplating jazz." I'm not sure what that means, but it sure did bring me some really vivid visuals, and it was supposed to. That's what Ginsberg did. That's what Kerouac did. So it was all about getting people to feel something. All right. There were also artists that rebelled in the same way. Now, art had been pretty tame, you know, pretty realistic and that sort of thing. So a guy named Jackson Pollock, and I'll show you a couple of pictures here in a bit, he expanded into what they call abstract expressionism. And what it did was Jackson Pollock, and I should probably just go to his picture because he explains the goal was not that it doesn't mean anything. Don't look at my pictures and try and figure out what they mean. They don't mean anything. Just be in it. Experience it. And that's what these Beat generation artists were about. So you can see here the picture on the top where he has buckets of paint. And the paintings at the bottom that he was working on, he would actually walk around inside the painting. And so for him, painting was not just about what was on the canvas. It was about being a part of the painting and being in the painting. And he said, you know, I'm more at ease. I feel like I'm part of the painting. I can walk around in it. So that was a unique idea, and people really loved this. They became very popular, very famous, and if you can find a Jackson Pollock painting today, you can make a lot of, they're worth millions of dollars. Okay, let's see, who else? Oh yeah, we got some writers. J.D. Salinger wrote Catcher in the Rye, and you may have read that book in high school. And it's a story about somebody who's basically kind of lost and looking for something that means something. And so teenage angst. The Wild One with Marlon Brando was a movie that expressed the same sort of dissatisfaction with life, and I'm going to break all the boundaries and go find out what life is really about. So books, movies, A Rebel Without a Cause, a real famous actor at the time with James Dean. Same sort of, like, I'm not going to follow your rules, I'm not going to do what I'm supposed to do, I'm going to be the bad boy. Let's see, what else we got? Oh yes. The invention of television. Now, television had been around in the 40s, but nobody had one. It's kind of like the radios in the 19-teens. Before, you know, it was just something that scientists and electrical geeks played with. They were invented, but nobody had one at home, and there was, even if you had one, there were no shows on. But in the 1950s, we bought TVs like crazy, and that meant there needed to be programs for them. So we, in the 1920s, would sit around the radio and listen to the stories that were told on the radio, and you could imagine what was going on. Now we sat around the television and watched and heard. So you no longer had to use your imagination about what was going on. You could actually see it. And so by 1957, we had sold 40 million TV sets. That is an amazing number in just 10 years. TV was very different back then. It started in the morning. Well, first of all, you'd turn the TV on and there was nothing there until 6 o'clock or 7 o'clock or 8 o'clock, whenever the TV station would come on. They would play the national anthem and they'd say, welcome, you know, we're on for the day. And then they would have a lineup of shows that would be on. And then at 10 o'clock at night, they'd say, okay, that's the end of the day. We'll see you all tomorrow. And then they'd play the national anthem, and then it would go to nothing. There was nothing on there. So it was much different than what we experience today. And people wanted to be entertained. There were all kinds of shows that were created. Stereotypes were reinforced. There was a lot of sitcoms, what we would call sitcoms, but they were families. It showed families. Like this one was the Nelsons, Ozzie and Harriet and their 2 sons. And it was basically how the things that, you know, the boys would get in trouble, or they'd be struggling with their grades, or they would be playing sports, or they'd be going out on a date, and it was like what happened in the family. And of course, mom and dad were over there seeing it. It's the way we taught people how the family was supposed to be. And this, remember we were talking about women, this is where women learn their roles, where teenagers learn their roles, where fathers learn their roles. What are you supposed to do? So television was a great teacher for American society. And they all sort of looked the same. Because we had a strong, I know you can't see the words there, sorry about that. I threw this PowerPoint together from several other ones, and I didn't have time to fix it. But so the strong economy allowed people to stay in school longer. So you guys are, you know, you guys have free community college. We're encouraging you to go to school. In fact, we're encouraging everybody to go to a 4-year college. Back then, before the 50s, there were a lot of people who thought it was a waste of time to go to school. You didn't have time for that. You need to go out and get a job. But because the economy was so good, we encouraged people to stay in school longer and learn more and become a professional of some sort. They also had more time and more money to do events and dances and hang out and on into college after high school. And so all of that leisure time and money, because the economy was doing so well, they had more money. So what are they going to spend it on? Well, they're going to spend it on proms, they're going to spend it on cars, they're going to spend it on clothes, they're going to spend it on music, all kinds of things like that. It had a big impact, and it delayed adulthood. So I know you want to be treated like adults, but actually the society in the 1950s delayed adulthood for young people. Now, you can break down those doors if you want to, but you know, our society allows you to remain a child for a long time. And so that happened in the 50s. When you look at society today, a lot of that was started in the 1950s. All right, let's see what we got here. Okay, so again, sorry that it covers up some of the text, but what this is about is because we're talking about teenagers having more time and more money, and having more effect on the economy. In the early 50s, the people that bought music were people in their 20s. They had been to college, they had been in the military, they had gotten jobs, they'd just gotten married, and so they had money to buy records. But in the 1950s, that became teenagers. And that actually changed the kind of music that people were willing to make. Before, the music that they made was for an older group of people. But by 1957, most of the records were being bought by teenagers, and that's going to change the way music goes. This new thing called rock and roll became hugely popular, not with the older people, but with the teenagers. Rock and roll is a great story, and we're going to talk a little bit about it in a bit. Adults loved, I mean, if you were raised in the war and in the Depression, you were just glad that there was no war and no depression. You didn't need a lot of excitement. You didn't need a lot of difference. But the kids who were born at this time, they were the ones who were raised with this peace and prosperity, and they never knew how bad it could be. And so they were willing to take bigger chances. They wanted more chaos. They wanted more struggle. They wanted more reality. This felt like it wasn't real. But the older generation valued things like patriotism, commitment, the American dream, and conformity. We talked about that. And we talked about how the Beat generation kind of said, no, we don't think this is where you are going to find meaning and happiness. And so the young people grew up not understanding what life would be like without this. And so they pushed it aside. And that leads us to the 60s. So the 60s, you can see there's a different background, there's a different feel. The Beats grew up, and the teenagers that grew up in the 60s, they were all about personal expression and exploding boundaries. And it's not about conformity, it's about being yourself. And who said those rules matter and count? Who said I have to be patriotic the way you're patriotic? Who said I have to follow the sexual morals or mores that our society? Who says a woman needs to be married and a wife and have children? Who said any of this stuff? And that's what the 60s was all about. Sorry I can't play the music. You just have to imagine Jimi Hendrix here. All right, so I got a couple of slides generally about the 60s, and you notice this was the last thing that was in the 50s, and that is that those people liked those values, right? But when we get to the 60s, things change. So the people that change things, we're going to give them a name. And that name is called counterculture. Counterculture just means whatever the culture is, they went against it. And that was sort of the theme of the 60s. Whatever it is, we're against it. You say black, we're going to say white. You say white, we'll say black. You say quiet, we'll be loud. You want loud, we'll be quiet. That was the way that counterculture was established. Who said these rules? Who made these rules? We didn't make these rules. You guys, you older people, made these rules, and we don't buy them. We don't know that they're true or correct. And so that was sort of the theme of the 60s. So, of course, anything was personal freedom, alternative lifestyles, not living in a little house that looked like your neighbor's, not going to work from 9 to 5, not having the the parties and the Boy Scouts. It was like, we're going to blow all of that social norm apart. We're going to do anything different that we can. Who knows? Maybe we'll find meaning and happiness there. Now, the real counterculture, which is what CC means, the real counterculture people were pretty radical, and it scared most people. In other words, if you actually take away some of the things we're going to talk about and you go, wow, could I really live like that? Most people said, no. You could look like a hippie. You could listen to the music that the hippies did. You might even experiment with a few of their drugs. But you actually aren't counterculture because you didn't buy it all the way to your soul. And so probably only, I don't know, maybe 10 or 15% of the kids were actually counterculture kids. The rest of us, and I was one of those who was not a counterculture kid, the rest of us just wanted to look and sound like it because it was cool. But you didn't actually want to do it because it was actually pretty scary. And you'll understand why as we go through this lecture. There were some pretty crazy things going on. I thought they were crazy, and they were scary, right? And I didn't want to die, and I couldn't go along with it. But I didn't want people to know that I didn't go along with it. So I kind of tried to look like everybody else. There was some changes even in the church, and we're going to break it into two because these are the two churches that were the biggest ones in America, the Catholic Church and the Protestant Church. In the Catholic Church, there was a thing called the Second Vatican Council, or Vatican II. It was from 62 to 65, and the Catholic Church got together, and the Pope called all the bishops and said, okay, we need to do something here. We're losing too many young people. And so they wanted to make the Catholic Church more personal, so it had some meaning for the young people that were going. And so they made changes to update church doctrines. Now, I want to change that word doctrines. I'm going to say church practices. They didn't really change their beliefs. So, like, the Catholic Church teaches that the Bible is the Word of God. They teach that Jesus died on the cross. They teach the sacraments. They teach church attendance. Those are all doctrines of the church. Practices are different. In other words, when you go to Mass on Sunday, what do you do? That's your practice. And so that's what they changed. They didn't change their doctrines. They changed their practices. So what they did was they actually increased the role of the laity. Now you see down there, laity is another word for church members. It's a fancy word or a good vocabulary word. You should learn the word laity. But it just means the church members. So if you go to a Catholic church, there's a priest up front. And the priest is the clergy. He's the paid professional religious person. The laity are the people that just go to the church. And so, it says Mass not in Latin. Yeah, so that's another thing. So this is where they allowed the laity, the church members, to start leading music and start reading the scriptures and start doing some of the things that only the priest had done before to get them more involved. Because when you're more involved, you pay more attention, it makes more sense. They also changed, up until Vatican II, the Mass was usually in Latin, and unfortunately, most people didn't speak Latin. It was a dead language. And so you would go to Mass, and you would hear the Mass in Latin, but you didn't understand what the words meant. But you knew you were supposed to be there. So what they did was they started doing the Mass in what they called the vernacular. The vernacular is the language of the people. So I'm speaking American or English right now. And so what they did was the priest would start saying the Mass, but they would say it in English so you could understand. If you went to a Spanish church, you would hear it in Spanish. If you went to a French church, you would hear it in French. So this was more personal. It was connected to the people, and that's what they were trying to do. And so a lot of the practices of the Catholic Church changed in the 60s to make it more relevant to the people, because people were getting turned off by the inability to connect to what was going on. The Protestant Church also changed, and they had another, I guess they'd call it a revolution. Time magazine, the cover of Time magazine, called it the Jesus Revolution. And what the Protestant Church did was similar to what the Catholic Church did. Remember, the Protestant Church doesn't have priests, but they follow the Bible. And the Bible had been translated in 1607 by King James of England into English. And it sounded like, Shakespeare. Really hard to understand. And so what they did was they retranslated the Bible. It's the same Bible, the same stuff, but they used modern language so people could read it and understand it. You can read and understand Shakespeare, but it's a lot of work. And so people thought, why does it need to be this way? Why can't we translate it? And so they came out with a thing called the Living Bible, and it was a Bible that you could read and understand, and it took all the these and thus saiths and all that, and it turned it into he, she, and you, and it, and he said, and that kind of stuff. So it made it easier to understand. It was called the Jesus Movement. And I have a song here that you can't hear, sorry. Okay. The Protestant church brought in popular music, rock music, folk music into the church. We started seeing drums and guitars instead of organs and pianos, which a lot of the Protestant churches who thought this was bad, there was old school churches, and they would say that was bad. And then there was the new modern churches that were pushing this stuff. So this guy, Chuck Smith, was a pastor in Costa Mesa, and he was sort of one of the big leaders of this Jesus movement. I think he just recently died. Still lived in Southern California. But you notice that part of this stressed experience over doctrine, where, it's like, what do you have to believe? We have to believe this, 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 and this. And Chuck Smith and this Jesus movement was like, no, I just want to walk with Jesus. I want to experience Jesus. That's why they call it the Jesus movement. It's not important if I understand all the details of all the doctrines, as long as I experience my religion. And so this Jesus movement was experientially based. They didn't necessarily go against the doctrines. They just didn't promote them and didn't think they were that important. Anyway, so Southern California was one of the big centers of this Jesus movement. Chuck Smith, this guy, actually started a thing called Calvary Chapels, and now they have them around the world. It's that big of a movement even today. Yeah. All right. So now we're going to get back to the kind of, so those were the sort of the introductory to the 60s slides, and now we're going to go to the counterculture again. There were 6 common characteristics. And so the counterculture, this is going against what was. So I had a song that went with each one of these, so sorry you don't get to hear the songs. I'll be so glad when I'm back in class and I can do my real lectures. Anyways, communal living. Remember, in the 50s, everybody had their own little house. 2-bedroom, 3-bedroom house, 1 bath, tiny little houses. Everyone could afford one, but everybody had their own. And they're going, who says everybody has to have their own? Who said that? Who even says that a family is a mom and a dad and kids? What if you just didn't have families? What if you all lived together in a commune and you didn't worry about that? There were 2 centers for this. San Francisco, called the Haight-Ashbury District, and if you can see the street signs there, that's actually Haight Street and Ashbury Street, and that was the district. There was square blocks that people tried to turn into these communes. In New York, it was called the East Village. So these were 2 communal-based living areas where nobody owned anything. Just everybody had everything, whatever. And so that was sort of the idea. Some people left the cities and moved out to the country, and they thought that was better, but the idea was the same. You could have, well, the children they didn't belong to anybody. They were the groups. Everybody took care of the children, and the children answered to everybody. You could have multiple sex partners because you didn't belong to anybody. You weren't in a committed relationship. You were committed to the group. So sexuality, children, belongings, everything belonged to everybody. And this was the experiment that went against the culture that said, no, you have your own family, you have your own house, you have your own job, you have your own lawnmower, you have your own car. Let's go against that. And so that was the communal living. And actually, this was one of the things that I think scared a lot of people from being truly counterculture. They looked at that and they said, don't think so. And there were some people that lived this way, and probably it pushed everybody a little bit that way. You know, divorce is going to become much more common in the 60s. Marriage becomes questionable. You don't have to marry somebody and live with them. It was actually probably started in the late 50s and early 60s and blossomed under this the hippie or the counterculture movement. It said, who said? Who said this is supposed to be this way? What if it's not? A lot of them tried to work through a self-sufficient environment, live off the land, and that was not easy. It was hard, but can be very fulfilling. Probably the beginnings of our environmental movement started in the 60s, where we decided maybe cities were not good for people, and pollution and gasoline engines, and couldn't we go back to living off of the land and being natural? That was a 60s theme that was started by the counterculture. Second thing, so besides communal living, is drugs. Drugs were huge in the 60s, and a little different than what you might think. They were not just, this was not just to get high. It became that, but it wasn't necessarily started that way. So a lot of people in the 60s experimented with drugs. Sorry, those pictures are in the way. Marijuana was the most popular. It was called a gateway drug. Marijuana, if you take my psychology class, you'll understand, marijuana lowers your affective filter. It does a lot the same as alcohol. But alcohol was like old hat. That's what your parents did. They drank alcohol. But pot did sort of the same thing. What it does, you have something inside of your head that says, you know, when somebody says something, you know, I could really be, I make a statement and you go, I could really make fun of him. I could say something that would embarrass him. And you go, I probably shouldn't do that. He's the teacher and he would get mad. And so you have a filter in your head that tells you, you probably could think it, but don't say that because that wouldn't be good. Because you have that filter. What alcohol and marijuana do is they lower that filter so that you go, you just say things you might not have said, you do things you might not have done. And so that's why marijuana was considered a gateway drug, because it lowers that affective filter, and things which you might not normally do, you go, oh, what the heck. And so once you had smoked a little bit of marijuana, then it wasn't so scary to drop some acid or take a hit of some other drug that you might normally be afraid of. So a lot of people smoked pot. A lot of people have still, you know, we just changed the law that made it legal for people over 21 to use it for recreational use. It still works the same way. Don't know that it leads to more drug use or less drug use, but at that time, it was a gateway or a way into more drugs. Sorry, that picture covered it up, but it says, some used LSD. So LSD was a drug that was developed by Timothy Leary, who was a professor up at, I think, Berkeley in California, I'm not sure. But actually, these drugs, these hallucinogenic drugs, were actually created as experiments to see if we couldn't expand the use of your mind. You know, your mind is tremendously powerful, and you don't use the full potential of it. And so they were trying to actually find a chemical boost that would get you beyond the normal barriers so that you could be more creative, so that you could be more in touch, so that you could apprehend more reality. And that was actually the goal when they started producing these things. Unfortunately, they didn't do much testing other than, hey, let's try this. And they'd take it. And it was a mind-blowing experience. Unfortunately, that was in both a good way and a bad way. In the good way, it did produce thinking and ideas and experiences that you couldn't get without the drugs. And that was pretty enticing and alluring. The unfortunate part was it also fried a lot of people's brains and actually did permanent brain damage to them, and they didn't know that. You would see it happen, but then those people went away, and it was only the kids who survived and came back the next day who said, yeah, it was really cool. The kid who actually OD'd or the kid who was taken to a mental institution, you didn't hear from him again. And so the positives stayed out there in society and the negatives got hidden away. The older people looked at it and said, this is wrong. And of course, nobody listens to the older people. When you're a young counterculture person, you just go, yeah, you're just saying that. So a lot of these drugs that were experimental drugs were used once people used them and they really enjoyed the experience, they became addicted to them. And it destroyed a lot of people's lives, a lot of my friends' lives. And that was another thing that I think, you know, in my experience, I was not counterculture. I didn't do drugs because it scared me. I heard about it. I saw friends of mine. Some of them died. Some of them were permanently affected. Some of them, it didn't affect them at all. They just had a good time and it was okay. But you never knew. It was like flipping a coin and you go, okay, am I going to be okay this time? And I just wasn't willing to take that chance. And I think a lot of people were not willing to take that chance. So if you were counterculture, you did drugs. So yes, the older people, of course, they said, this is wrong, you shouldn't be doing this. All right, we're going to leave drugs and move to fashion. You know, look at the background. That's called tie-dye. And the purpose of tie-dye was not just nice colors, it was unreproducible. That means every single one was hand done, and it was you couldn't make another one like it. And I learned how to do tie-dye when I was in high school, took an art class, and that was a couple of our projects were tie-dye. And it was a statement of non-conformity. And I'm not going to color inside the lines. I'm going to, in a sort of fashion, took on that tie-dye sort of feeling. Remember, we were actually trying to go against what we had seen as a counterculture. And in the areas of dress, you know, I could put a shirt on, I could wear a pair of pants, I could wear my hair a certain way, and it didn't change inside. It was just an expression of, I don't like what my parents are doing. I don't like what my grandparents, the way they dress. I want to be different. And so this is where the term hippies came from. People who were hip, they dressed in pretty crazy, wild ways. Colorful, outrageous clothes. Anything that was crazy, shocked. You look at the guy in the, you know, the headband up there. Freedom and painting the body and that kind of stuff, you know, doesn't really do damage to your body. It just is an expression. So dress was done by almost everybody. Some of it shocked the mainstream. Some of it, they just laughed at us. Girls started wearing miniskirts. One of the taboos from the culture was you dressed modestly. You cover up parts of your body that have been considered sexual. And so people said, well, why? Why do I have to do this? What difference does it make? And so mini skirts were created. Long hair for men and women was the norm. All right, political activism. Everybody seemed to be political. And I know it's hard to imagine that people being less political or more political than they are today. It seems like everybody, America right now is politically really divided and very, at each other's throat. It was the same way, but today I would say you would have this conflict between not just old against the young, which is this kind of political activism, but today's activism is right-wing versus left-wing. And there's old right-wing and young right-wing, and there's old left-wing and young left-wing, and they're duking it out this way. This was political activism that was youth-based, so the young people tended to be more politically active, and some of it was about laws, a lot of it was about the Vietnam War, which was going on through the 1960s. We're not going to get a chance to get to the Vietnam War. I'm sorry. One of my favorites. But so most of the young people were politically active, and the biggest message was, get the government out of my face and get our soldiers home from Vietnam. So the counterculture and the protesters were the same thing, and I would say that's probably true. Probably at least 60 to 70% of the time. So the older, especially the World War II veterans, they didn't understand this burning the flag and standing up and saying America sucks, we need to get out of Vietnam, we're wrong, that kind of stuff. They just saw it as unpatriotic and that it was wrong. And so there was a gap. We called it a generation gap. The older generation didn't see things the way the younger generation saw them. And that went into politics, and the younger generation was for more social activism, helping the poor, use the government to do that. Don't use it to make bombs, don't use it to go to war, don't use it for those kinds of things, use it for good things. Sexuality changed. I'm not going to spend too much time on this. You already get that. We already talked a little bit about it. The sexual revolution of the 60s. Let's see, there we go. A lot of people, remember we talked about communal living. One of the tenets of communal living and the sexual revolution of the 60s was a thing called free love, and that was you didn't have to have a commitment to a person you had sex with. So sex was not considered, well, who says it's personal? That was sort of the mantra. It's like, who made these rules, right? What if we didn't have these rules? What if you could have sex like you go into the ice cream parlor and have a chocolate ice cream or a strawberry ice cream? Is there one right, one wrong? Who made these rules? And so they decided to experiment, the counterculture, with this thing called free love. Now, that's sort of, what would I say? It's sort of what we are experiencing. The result is today. So nowadays, there's a lot more people that would say marriage is not necessary for sexuality. There are some people that still do. I'm one of those, but I'm old, remember. But I grew up in a society that said sex outside of marriage was wrong. Nowadays, most people have slid towards, nah, it's not necessary. Marriage is not necessary. And so it's sort of interesting, wherever you fall on those ideological lines, it's important to know that this is an outgrowth of the 60s, the 50s and the 60s into the 70s. And of course, there's going to be a backlash against that in the 70s and the 80s and the 90s. But so marriage actually fell way out of favor, and then it came back again, and now it's sort of, it's like a pendulum. It goes back and forth, and it's kind of settling into the middle, I think. I don't know. We'll see. I'm not a prognosticator. I don't have a crystal ball seeing what it's going to be like in 30 years or 40 years or for your children or the next generation. But in the 60s, this was a let's try this. And it scared a lot of people. It also led to a lot bigger spread. It wasn't that they didn't exist before, but free love or sexuality was much more confined and much more connected to a committed relationship. And so guess what? There were a lot less STDs. And AIDS hadn't even been heard of until the 80s. So, but that came along later on, but it was still limited if you were in a committed monogamous relationship. If you only had sex with one person, you were not going to get these things, STDs, generally. However, so this free love led to this spread and the growth of lots of STDs. Also, one of the things that helped this was the invention of the birth control pill, which actually, allowed young people to engage in sexuality without the fear or without the consequence of becoming pregnant. So that was huge in allowing the sexual revolution to take place in the 1960s. It was a lot more convenient, and it was less fraught with downside of having a child or having to deal with a pregnancy. Movies and culture in itself sort of experimented with these ideas. Music, I'm going to go through this kind of quick. You guys know the music of the 60s, and if you don't, shame on you. But I can't play it on the video here because YouTube would shut it down. So, much of the music was what would you call it, protest music. Most of the music had some, so it was either protesting the culture, protesting the war, protesting materialism, protesting, all the protests of the 60s were put into the music of the 60s. And even some of the music itself was designed to be used in the 60s with the drug culture. So we call that psychedelic music. We'll get there in a bit. Probably the guy who was, when you listen to Bob Dylan, if you listen to Bob Dylan, you go, this is rock and roll. He was actually a crossover between folk and rock, but he told the story. His folk music roots allowed him to do poetry and tell what we were feeling. And so Bob Dylan was sort of the mouthpiece of the counterculture. And a lot of his songs, I don't know how many of them, but most of his songs, I would say, are protest songs about culture and the society. Then, of course, the British invasion, and that started with the Beatles and turned into the Rolling Stones and a few others. But the Beatles were the first big ones, and this was not so much, there was some protest music, there were some protest lyrics in their music, but it was also just an expression of let's explore and let's see if we can find meaning. And the Americans ate up the Beatles. It just was totally phenomenal. In the late 60s, a thing called psychedelic rock, and that's what I was talking about. People like Jimi Hendrix and that kind of stuff, distorted music. And so the psychedelic experience, what was that? Well, you take psychedelic drugs, so like LSD, and then you put yourself in a psychedelic environment. So you put yourself into a room that's got strobe lights, black lights, color walls, all kinds of flashing lights that would cause the trip you were on to be accentuated. And then the psychedelic music was also distorted and was supposed to be a combined experience. Remember, experience was the root of the 60s. I want to experience something. I want it to experience more and more and more. So drugs, lights, artwork, and now music. Psychedelic rock was designed to be used with psychedelic drugs, and it was supposed to enhance the experience. We're going to finish up talking about Woodstock. 1969 was a huge festival in New York, and it started off, you should read a little bit about Woodstock. It was amazing on all kinds of fronts. It was supposed to be out in this farmer's field. They didn't think it was going to be that big of a deal, and hundreds of thousands, like 500,000 people showed up for this thing. It rained. It was 3 days long, and people were just the counterculture on full display. The counterculture completely musically. The counterculture with the drugs. The counterculture with the sex. The counterculture with the everything piled into this 3-day thing. And, you know, actually, a lot of people thought Woodstock was the epitome. That means the best of the counterculture. And a lot of people looked at Woodstock and said, yes, this is all the worst of the counterculture. So it depended on what you thought about the lifestyle and about all of those things. It depended on what you thought of Woodstock. But nobody didn't have an opinion about Woodstock. You can listen to the music. They recorded it on the Woodstock album, and it was recorded live, and a lot of you can hear all the protest songs and all that, and it's really different. There are so many different kinds of music that happened at Woodstock. Anyway, so we're going to close the 60s with that, and this gives you an idea of what America was going through. I'll put that into context with all of that we've been learning about spies and McCarthyism and the nuclear fear, and you put all that kind of stuff together and then add into it the civil rights movement, which we haven't really covered at all, and probably not going to have the time to do that. We'll see, maybe. But this was just American culture through the 50s and the 60s. You put that into the Cold War cover. Put it inside the ball of the Cold War. It was a pretty crazy time for America. All right. Let's see. All right. I think that's the end of the lecture. And so hope you enjoyed it. Take some good notes, and I will catch you later.